Hey everybody, Trapper here. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Colorado TechCast. Colorado TechCast is a weekly podcast where I interview CEOs and founders of Colorado-based technology startups. Join me each episode as I explore the Colorado technology community from the inside out. I'm joined again by Franny Matthews, President and CEO of the Colorado Technology Association. The Colorado Technology Association, or CTA, is the state's premier technology advocate and community hub for tech in the state. Check them out online at coloradotechnology.org. Today we're joined by JB Holston. JB is an absolute powerhouse and has been a driving force behind many of the things that has put Colorado on the map when it comes to entrepreneurship and technology. JB is the Dean of Engineering and Computer Science at DU, Senior Advisor on the Innovation Response Team. That's the team responsible for Colorado's response to COVID-19, and CEO and President of the Greater Washington Partnership, based out of Washington, D.C. This is a special two-part interview, so make sure to catch the second half of our talk. Now, let's go ahead and get started. JB, you've got a ton of history and a ton of knowledge in your head and thoughts and opinions. We're here today to just tap into that a little bit. What have you been up to recently?
Well, thanks, Trapper, and thanks, Franny, for having me. Obviously, a big, long-time supporter of CTA, but first-time podcast caller with you folks. So I'm enjoying the opportunity to have a conversation. I have sort of three jobs at the moment. I'm the Dean of Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Denver, and in that role, of course, like every other educator in the country, very much focused on how do we get back to opening for the fall, while also finishing up this quarter as well as we can and trying to find all our great students jobs. And then I've been very involved with the state as a senior advisor on the innovation response team for the governor in terms of response on COVID, which, as Franny and you and I were talking a bit earlier, is a story that will need to be written at some point. And then I'm getting ready for my new gig. In September, I start as the president and CEO of an initiative called the Greater Washington Partnership back in the nation's capital. So I'm trying to spend a little bit of time getting prepped for that as well. So those are my 3 day jobs.
Well, JB, we're excited about this new endeavor, but we don't like having losing you at least part-time to the Washington area. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this new, the Washington Partnership, Greater Washington Partnership is all about? And we talked a little bit about collaboration. How do you see this expanding rather than just changing?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking, Franny. Part of the reason I'm excited about it is that I think a lot of the lessons learned there are going to be really interesting and valuable for our continued growth of our ecosystem here, but also vice versa. I think part of the reason they were interested in me is because of all the great collaborative Colorado work that's gone on to build our innovation ecosystem. The partnership back there started in about 2016 when the largest employers in that region got together because they were going to try to put together a bid for the Olympics. And obviously, in order to do that, Virginia on its own, Maryland on its own, DC on its own, none of those were big enough to really make that work. So these folks all got together, and that bid failed, but they realized they liked working together and that there were these really, really hard problems that were best addressed on a regional basis, and that they, as the biggest employers in that region, were really uniquely situated to address those. They hit my radar back when I was involved in our efforts here to get the Amazon HQ2. And you may recall Virginia actually ended up winning, Northern Virginia ended up winning that bid. And part of the Greater Washington Partnership was a big reason why. That group was able to get, for example, the state of Virginia to make a $500 million commitment to open up a new innovation campus for Virginia Tech in Arlington, just outside of DC, which was part of how Amazon became convinced that not only was there a good base set of tech talent, but that they were really going to expand that tech pipeline and invest in trying to do that. So I saw that and, was jealous and thought that was that was great. And then they approached me a few months ago. We started talking. They've done great work in education. They're looking at alternative digital certificate and other kinds of pathways for talent. And they've done a really super job, and I know how hard this is, but to get a lot of the higher ed establishments as well as industry involved. They're doing really good work on transportation. They've organized about $500 million in permanent funding per year for incremental regional transportation, which is a really big deal back there. They're starting to do work on housing. And then, of course, COVID hit. So like every other initiative everywhere, there's a lot of focus on reopening, rehiring, building back. What do the plans look like to do that well? And they're, given who backs them, they're about 30 of the largest employers now are funding this initiative. They're in a really important position to share best practices quickly and kind of help set the scene for the best way to do that for the region. So all that was exciting to me. It's interesting. I think what's really exciting too is I think Washington is going to be a bigger part of our lives for the next few years than any of us anticipated or probably wanted. So centering an initiative like this in the nation's capital. I've done a lot of work with the United Nations over the last few years around the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are opportunities, I think, to sort of show how you can have a regional initiative married to a nation's capital and do some really, really interesting and relevant things. So that's exciting too. But they've got a lot to learn back there about growing an innovation economy. So that's something I'm going to bring from what we've learned here back there.
Well, I think you've been a big leader in our collaboration in the state. We really have an amazing culture here. And one of the areas that we really have something that's very special is the collaboration between large and small companies. Can you talk a little bit about your work in the entrepreneurial space and how important you think that is for a community?
Yeah, I think, I'm old enough to remember back when I first moved to Colorado almost 3 decades ago, very restricted economy. We had sort of oil and gas and computer storage and maybe a little, and the cable industry was kind of nascent, but very subject to, economic, sort of good and bad times, et cetera. And if you look at us now, we're incredibly more diversified, but we're also really a font for and an attractor for tech talent and for innovation. And a lot of that really has been grassroots, and Franny, the work that CTA has done has been central to that, of course. And in parallel, just the community, I tell folks all the time about the story of Denver Startup Week, right? Started on the back of a napkin a few years ago, and now it's by far and away the largest startup week in the galaxy. And, how did that happen? Well, it was kind of that grassroots effort on the part of all the innovators and everyone contributing to the innovation community, and also all the large companies collectively saying, hey, this is a good thing, right? If we break these barriers down, a lot of really cool, serendipitous, new, creative things can happen. Let's go do that. I think that, the Colorado story, Hickenlooper talks a lot about it, and he's been a big contributor to it, but it's a pretty unique story in the country. The ability of this place to build an entire innovation economy on top of, in parallel to, as a substrata to everything else that was going on is remarkable. And I could go on, but when we started the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network, I was the founder of that. One of the things that the Blackstone Group, massive private equity group out of New York, said in picking Colorado and then in supporting the initiative, and they've just re-upped for another few years as well, was that this is the only place in the country where they could see this working. Now I'll have to convince them that the Washington area is another place where it could work, but that here there were no barriers to collaboration around innovation. You didn't have different political parties thinking of it differently. You didn't have different parts of society thinking about it differently. You didn't have large companies thinking about it differently. Everybody was, agreed that building an innovation economy out here was just a super good thing to do. And so everybody's just thrown in every way that they could to get that to happen. Brad Feld talks a lot about give first, right? That kind of ethos is a big part of it as well. And when you do that, really cool stuff occurs and gets created and then gets to scale if everybody contributes to it. because egos don't get in the way. And I think that's been a big part of it too. So it's a great story. I think it's still nascent. We didn't get Amazon HQ2, and a lot of people feel like that was a good thing, but I was one who thought it would have been great to have them because, I look at the students that we're training and where they're going to go, and having an Amazon here is just such a lodestone for spin-offs, startups, talent, philanthropy, just all kinds of great things. We didn't get it. We didn't get it in part because I don't think we built our ecosystem yet to be strong enough to really be as competitive as it could be. So there's still things to do, but boy, tons of great progress in the last few decades.
Yeah, I think that the collaboration is really, kind of a cornerstone of the ethic here. And the other thing is that we execute. You can have collaboration and think about all these things till the cows come home, but if you don't do something about it, you really didn't do anything. So I think that's pretty amazing. The other thing that I think is amazing is that we've done some pretty cool things, and certainly handling COVID is an example of the public and private sectors coming together to solve problems. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been involved with from the innovation side of this, and maybe even the supply side, as we have gone through this triage and emergency part of COVID?
Yeah, well, as you know, and as most listeners I'm sure know, when as the governor started to gear up to address the issue, he created a couple of initiatives. One's called an innovation response team, and another is an economic recovery team. And, he asked a bunch of private sector folks to stand up to help build capacity around both those topics in parallel to, and kind of joined at the hip as much as possible with the state. And I think Jared's insight was that there's just a lot of stuff we were going to have to figure out or do really quickly that was going to be very difficult to address strictly with, the state, the government bureaucracy, for no reason other than that nobody had ever had to deal with any of this before. And, when you're dealing with an exponentially growing virus, you can't move fast enough. So, he had the insight to create those initiatives very early. And then the work of the initiatives, it's a very Colorado story. It's really changed over time. Initially we were running around trying to find ventilators. I mean, literally it was, I would get on calls at 2 a.m. with folks who'd say, hey, my brother-in-law in Shanghai has 2,000 of these ventilators that I can get for $38,000 a piece if you give me cash by 6 a.m. What do you think? So, we were running around just like crazy trying to source personal protective equipment, ventilators, all of this stuff. And the work moved from all of that, partly because we were able to solve for some of those things pretty quickly, partly because, social distancing and the other measures that were put in place meant that we got on top of the virus better than the original forecasts had feared, which was super. And so one of the interesting initiatives then that sprung up on the economic recovery side was this initiative called Energize Colorado. So, if Brad Feld, whom Jared asked to step in with Federico Pena and Betsy Markey on the economic recovery side, did what Brad does wonderfully, which, helped motivate. We probably had 400 volunteers at some point, may have more than that now, to try to collectively figure out what could we do that might be helpful, that was, filling in gaps, right? And to your point, Franny, that was really like it was doing stuff, right? It wasn't just sort of sit around and come up with policy proposals for the long haul or whatever. All that stuff was good too. So, Energize Colorado launched formally probably 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, I don't know, something like that. But it's very much focused on recovery, though with a very Colorado term for it, which is Energize, but for firms under 500 people, because I think what everybody identified was that as kind of a gap that, like, the really big firms, I've talked to Lockheed Martin a ton of times over the last few weeks, and they're on top of it. They got it down. They know what they're doing. They've been able to keep operating. They're continuing to hire. They're just, they're also buying enough disinfectant to like clean the New Orleans Superdome 3 times a week every week or something. But the smaller companies, what's the right thing to do? What's the best practice? What's the playbook for reopening? All of that kind of work. How do you deal with mental health, right? Among your employees, if you're a smaller company. So Energize Colorado really ended up focusing on that as the issue. And so now, if you go to the website or you get involved in any of their activities, there's just all this, stuff going on, helping people navigate PPP, right? That was a big thing that had to happen early on, et cetera. And that initiative is really very independent of the state. It was all a bunch of volunteers. It all got stood up independently. It's all rocking and rolling. It's connected to the SBA, the Small Business Administration, to OEDIT, to all those parts of the state where need be. But it was a classic Colorado thing, just a whole bunch of really great innovators who collectively said, let's go try to come up with something that can address that issue. So it hasn't all been, again, it doesn't always work, right? I mean, standing up, my simplistic view on things is when you're chasing an exponential virus from behind, you can't catch up, right? I mean, when you start late and you're chasing it from behind, you're already in trouble. And so much as I think the state's done a great job and been really adept, et cetera, it hasn't always been simple or easy, right? How do you get private entities to help address things like contact tracing, right? You and I spoke a little bit about that before. How does that work relative to the local public health authorities? Who has jurisdiction, right? How do you resolve that? It's not all necessarily as clean as something like Energize Colorado, where you can just sort of set it up, get it going, and off it runs. And so these public-private partnerships can be tough, but Colorado's still small enough, and that may just be because I've been around for long enough. But and everybody again tends to just have that inherent share to gain mentality that people tend to be very, very willing to just throw in to try to figure it out and solve the problem. By contrast, kind of New York and Silicon Valley tend to get very transactional about a lot of this sort of stuff, in my view. And that's just not the way it is here. So I think there's been some really good stories out of the effort around COVID on the public-private partnership side. But it's definitely not always easy. But I think the circumstances are why it's particularly hard in this case, because everyone's just trying to solve so quickly for something that no one's ever had to address before.
Yeah, and we all know innovation is messy. I mean, by its very nature, you're going to have messiness, and you just have to. I always look at it like, how much is in the glass? How much water did we get in the glass? So
that's a good way to think about it.
Let's talk a little bit about where we are now. We're starting to reopen, and we're starting to see. I mean, this is a very complex environment. What are your thoughts on the important things to minimize the health risk while getting this economy started back up and our society started back up? And probably do it in the context of what's going on at DU.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I love the study that's been out that says that, if 80% of people wore face masks, just, the normal cloth covering, we would tamp this thing down. So there's actually like a simple, cheap solution, which is just get everybody to do what Asian countries are doing, which is when you go out, wear a darn mask. Unfortunately, that's become a really politicized issue here in the country. And that's a bummer, because everything else we're going to have to do is going to be a lot more expensive and take a lot more time. So that's one. I think higher ed is in a particularly interesting position, and I don't know that everybody's. Obviously, those of us in higher ed have, but I don't know that everyone else is focused on it. We're kind of like an airplane whose seats, are either going to get filled by September 8th or not. So all of higher ed, I mean, if you watch the news over the last few weeks, DU was one of the earlier universities in the country to say that it was going to reopen in the fall. And at the time, that was a fairly contentious statement. There was a lot of pushback, like, how can you know? How are you going to do that? And the reality was, we didn't know how we were going to do it, but we were committed to figuring it out because we had a view that would be the best thing to do. So you've seen more and more higher ed establishments around the country say that's their posture now, and that's a big shift over the last 2 to 3 weeks. But what that means relative to the general recovery efforts is that we're these little cities that are going to open up completely faster than anything else. And So we're a little case study, a little microcosm for how this is going to work, and what you got to do in order to make it work. The reason everyone wants to do it is there really are two. One is the economics of residential higher ed are such that the vast bulk of the 4,000 higher ed establishments across the country that have residential components are completely tuition dependent. And so if unlike Facebook, we can't just say, we'll just go remote for until there's a vaccine, because suddenly we're now all competing with Coursera. And so you can't do that. And but more to the point, students don't want to do that. I've seen some national polling. 75% of college students want to come back in the fall, and they're not particularly concerned. And they sure don't want to not be back. They don't want to have to take courses online. They don't want to be sitting in their parents' basement or whatever it may be. So all of us now are actively figuring out all the things that you need to figure out in order to reopen safely. And we have dorms, and we have cafeterias, and we have libraries. I mean, we have all of the places where a lot of people hang out. And we have 18 to 22-year-olds. So there's a lot of hanging out going on. But we also have events. We have D1 sports, et cetera. So I think, Franny, the point you made is the right one, which is it's really complicated. I was talking to one of the really senior scientists at CU Boulder yesterday, who, is an epidemiologist and a biologist and a microbiologist. And, the mathematical models that people are running to try to figure out how you address this stuff well are crazy. And those are just things like, how do I open up my dorms? So it's highly complicated, and you're not going to be able to do it in a way where there's no risk for anybody. You just can't do that. So like every governor is doing across the country, you figure out what magnitude of what kind of risk you can take, and then how do you respond? And so a lot of the work right now is, how do you be prepared to respond? How do you test in sufficient volumes? Who do you test? How frequently do you test? What tests do you use? Who provides the tests? And then what do you do once you have a test result? And who gets the test result? Right? And
how accurate are the tests?
How accurate are the tests? Yeah, it's why which test matters, right? You can do a lot of antibody testing for not much money, and they're 50% accurate if incidence is low in the population. So that doesn't help you a lot. So going through all of those things, and then contact tracing is another big issue, right? If you look at my friends at another university locally were saying that they think of themselves as like Singapore, right? Like their view is, think of ourselves as being Singapore at the beginning of all this in September. What did they do well? And therefore, how do we have to be prepared as if we were a city-state, because that's kind of what every university is, at that point in time to deal with this well. Well, what did they do? They had really good information systems. They did, sufficient amount of testing. They knew when there were hotspots that popped up, and they did the right kind of contact tracing. And then they isolated and supported as necessary. So those of us that are kind of running these mini cities and feel like we got to open them up are all figuring all those things out. Some enterprises don't feel that much of a rush because they have the luxury of letting people work remotely to a much greater degree for a much longer period of time. And I'm also an advocate of that, right? Like I think the work that Guild Education, a bunch of the tech leaders and others here did early on to say work from home, that was a really good cause. It's just that a whole lot of enterprises can't have their employees do that. But I think that's another way to help address this. The fewer interactions you've got, particularly the fewer interactions you've got without masks, the better able we're going to be to manage through this new normal.
It's been interesting to watch as places start opening up again and how compliant people are wearing masks. I've even seen some people wearing masks when they're riding their car and the windows are rolled up, or riding their bicycle down the street. And I'm not really sure how all effective that is, one way or the other. But I'd much rather be part of the solution than part of the problem. All right, this wraps up part 1 of our interview with JB. Stay tuned for part 2. Thanks for listening to this episode of Colorado TechCast. If you enjoyed it, head on over to our website at coloradotechcast.com for more episodes. You can also find us on Twitter at COTechCast. We love hearing your comments, so keep them coming. I'm Trapper Little, and I'll catch you again on the next episode of Colorado TechCast.